Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. My name's Tom, and today we are looking at more adventures in 172 scale tank building, collecting, or in this case, printing. So people who have watched my channel know that I collect 172 scale tank models, either some that I've built myself, although I'm not a very good model builder, so I tend to go with either buying the die-cast or pre-built plastic ones. And I'm sort of at a point, after about 10 years of collecting where I've got like a 200 of them. There's not a lot left out there on the market as far as different types of vehicles that I still need for my collection. So I've started sort of looking at 3D printing because I bought some 3D printed ones through eBay and thought it was sort of interesting. And then about a month and a half ago, I decided to just go out and buy a printer myself. I noticed prices had really come down on them. So I got a Creality Ender 3 Pro, I believe it's called. It's about 230 bucks on Amazon, and frankly, you can even get the non-pro version, which was really not that much different, for like 165. So prices have come down on those to where it's you're pretty affordable. So I thought, okay, I'll give it a try. I had been warned that this was not technology that was like just you pull it out of the box and it just works. It took about 2 hours to assemble the thing, and it took me quite a while to get it working relatively well. And even then, I still have a long way to go to where I'm really good at it. So you'll notice these prints I'm about to show are not like necessarily examples of the best quality work, but it's sort of what I've been able to do just sort of as a guy messing around with this technology. And this is all the stuff, of course, is in 172 scale. Most of the files you're going to find online, if you want to start doing this yourself, are going to be in either 1/100 scale or 1/200 scale. And if I didn't already collect in 172 scale, I'd probably just go with 1/100 scale because at 172 scale it takes quite a bit of time to print some of these. So even the smallest ones I've done were like 5 hours, and some of the larger ones are almost like a day because you got to print out the separate pieces. So it's not the fastest process, but like I say, I got time, and but there's still about 100 or so files of vehicles out there or more that I'd like to print. And most of these prints I grabbed off Thingiverse, which is I think one of the more popular of the websites where you can download files that people have created. And all these files that I'm showing off here were free. They're on the internet. So let's start looking at some of the stuff that's available, because I was sort of shocked when I started investigating to see all the different types of vehicles and the variety of stuff that's available for people to get and download. And again, I'm not presenting myself as an expert on by any stretch. This is just sort of what the average Joe can do with one of these machines, and just downloading stuff if you want to start building. And these models are not they're not fine scale model quality. They're kind of fairly workable representations, but for me that's good enough. And most of these I just threw a base layer of paint on. I haven't done any detail painting. So we'll start with this one because this is one of the few that I have not painted, and it is by far the lowest quality as far as the file itself. It's really basic. So this is an old M1921 medium tank, so the very first medium tank the US developed, not long after World War I. Never went to production, and as you can tell, this model is really lacking in detail, but it was the only one available online, and I thought, well, so this is the very first print I made successfully. So I haven't bothered to paint it because honestly I don't even think it deserves paint. it's so basic, but at least it gives you sort of an idea of what the scale of this vehicle was compared to other vehicles, which is one of the reasons I like collecting these models, is you can be able to put them up against each other and actually get a 3D representation of what they look like compared to another vehicle, which you can't really with books. It's always hard to judge scale. So that is that one. Unfortunately, there's not a better, more detailed file of it online, but it was, it's a super obscure vehicle in a lot of ways, so it's amazing somebody even bothered to make that. From there, let's keep going to sort of start up here. This is Soviet IS-7. There is I think it's one of the newer companies does make a pre-built IS-7, but it's super expensive, and I just hadn't bothered to order it. And then I saw this file and I said, oh, I'll print one out. And yeah, it's not bad. So the way usually these turrets work is there's just a big sort of cylinder on the bottom that fits into a hole. It's not like a traditional model where you got the little tabs. So it's just sort of sitting in there. If you're lucky, it's a pretty decent fit. If you're not, it's too big and you have to sand it down, or it's too small and it kind of is a little loose. This one's not too bad. And this one, the level of detail is not really that bad. I didn't even bother trying to print out the little machine gun because the little machine guns never look good. It's a little too fine scale for the printer to really do a good job of. But you know, it's a workable model of at this scale of an IS-7, which is just a cool tank. This one here, also something very cool. I was happy to add MBT-70. So obviously a vehicle that never went into production, but sort of an important one in terms of Cold War German and U.S. tank development. Again, not a super detailed file, but good enough. And you know, it's sort of fun because what I like about having these models is you can put them next to another model and physically compare them, and you can kind of see in 3 dimensions things that, you know, are only described in books. So if you take this and you hold it up to an M1 Abrams, it's interesting because you can see it's a much shorter vehicle, especially in the front, and that's because, of course, this has the driver and the turret. It doesn't need as much front as the Abrams because it doesn't need to fit a human driver who's, you know, the Abrams guy's laying down almost on his back. The other interesting thing is if you look at the rear of these, the profile of the little slope behind the turret and of the turret bay, in the engine bay, they're identical, which it makes sense because if in the early M1 development, one of the engine's options was the AVCR 1360, which is the same engine that was in the MBT-70. Of course, it was called the AVCR 1100 with the 70, but you know, it's still the same engine. So it's interesting to see that there were certain things that did carry over, even though these are very different tank designs. There are a few things that carried over, and that's what I like about having physical representations. You can sort of stick them together and look at them and examine them. This is the most dubious one that I've printed out. It's supposed to be an M50 Sherman. So the turret was sort of a separate piece somebody designed, and this is sort of the danger with 3D printing, because the files are just things that people have made and then put out there for free, which is fantastic that people are willing to do that, but you don't always know if it's perfect. So I think this one, the turret just really, the mantlet looks a little large to me, the gun seems a little long, and then the hull, I had chosen an M4A4 hull, because some of the first 50 M50s that were made by the Israelis in the early 60s were on M4A4 hulls with just the old traditional vertical volute spring suspension. Sort of, you know, by the 1967 war, all of them have been upgraded to HVSS, but I want to do one of the earlier ones. The problem with this, even though this one said it was an M4A4 hull, you can definitely tell there's not enough, it's not long enough. There's not the space between the road wheels that you see in the M4A4, so it really looks more like any of the other models of Sherman. So this one's a little dubious, I admit, but you know, your options for a Super Sherman, or shouldn't really call it Super Sherman because the Israelis didn't call it that, but the M50 in 1/72 scale, there's not a lot of options out there. Next we have the Zarini II, which was a Hungarian self-propelled gun during World War II. Relatively obscure vehicle, but I was super happy to find there's a lot of different files out there for Hungarian tanks. And I'd been interested in this vehicle ever since I picked up this book a couple of years ago, which I did a review of. So it was really fun to find a file for this. And the problem, though, if you do start getting into this, some of these files, so like this one's all one piece. So the tracks, you know, the way the printer works, it can't print on top of nothing. So it has to create sort of filler, which you all then have to take like a Sharpie, or I use a small chisel and get rid of it. And if you're not careful, you can damage. So you can see that there's some I might have to redo this one someday because there's some sort of structural parts of suspension I accidentally chipped away while I was trying to remove the excess material. But yeah, Zarini, and there's actually files for the Toldi and the Tyran and lots of other Hungarian vehicles. Here we have the Churchill 3-inch gun carrier, another one I thought was pretty cool. I mean, this is just the ugliest vehicle you can possibly imagine, and that's sort of what's fantastic about it. I was quite happy to find this one. It is just a Churchill tank with a big box and a gun stuck in the front of it, offset. It's just, you know, these never saw combat. They're just hideous, but that's sort of what's fantastic about them, as I said. Next, we have a Sexton. So, obviously a British Commonwealth self-propelled gun, sort of similar to the US M7 Priest, but with the British 25-pounder. And the printer, you can see it did a pretty decent job with what's a fairly complex shape because it's got the open interior there. And, you know, it was interesting. This file had about, you know, 8 different versions of the vehicle. You could print it either open or with like a canvas cover over the top, an early version, later version. This one I did. There were little hand guards that had printed out that kind of broke off when I was cleaning it, and I could have tried to glue them back on, but I was like, you know what, doesn't matter. This isn't a super fine scale model to begin with. I'm not going to worry about those little details. Next, we have the M109A6, the Paladin. So this is the version of the classic U.S. self-propelled gun that's been in service for eons now. This was the version where they did massive upgrades. It's basically a new turret for all intents and purposes. And not the newest version of the vehicle, though there is an A7 version out where they did massive improvements to the hull, sort of replacing a lot of the mechanical parts with sort of Bradley components. So, you know, the A7 version is almost a completely different vehicle than the original M109s. It's one of those vehicles that's gone through serious amounts of evolution, but this is the A6, the first one to be named the Paladin. And this one you can tell the detail's not quite as fine. Like you can see the machine gun, that's a good example of how the 3D printer just can't do it quite as well as it should in terms of detail. Like the barrel's awful thick looking and goofy, but overall, not too bad. Next, we have this one, and I'm not even sure how you pronounce the name of this thing, but it's the Israeli, the APC they made out of T-55s, which were captured by great numbers by the Israelis, and you know, they used them as tanks themselves, as what they call it, the Tyran 5, I think. So here we can hold it up to a T-55 model. You see this, so the scale's pretty good on this. And you can see how the Israelis converted it, which was really interesting because they put a new engine in it and mounted it lengthwise, and then left this channel in the back that actually sort of lifts up to create room for the guys to get over the hump of the transmission and exit out the rear of the vehicle. So this is an attempt at recycling old Soviet tanks as a heavy APC. I believe these are still in service with Israel. I'm sure they're not as preferred as the Namir. But this is it, what is it, like, I don't know how to pronounce it, ACHZ something something something. But it's a cool vehicle and one of the certainly strangest things anybody's ever done with a T-55. Up next we have this monster, which is, you can see the T-28 or T-95, whichever designation you want to use. This one's pretty cool because it has the removable track, because of course this vehicle had double tracks on each side. The one of these that still exists, you know, is down in Fort Benning for people that want to see it. It's been all painted up and restored real nice. But it was pretty cool. I was able to print one out, and you got I decided not to permanently glue these on because I like the idea of being able to remove them, although maybe one day I will, and then I'll just print out another version of it without the tracks. So yeah, definitely one of the coolest U.S. vehicles, and one of the strangest really from World War II, because the U.S. didn't make many direct fire turretless gun carriages. We really seem to prefer turrets, but not on this super heavy tank, as they like to call it. Then here we have a Ram 1. So this is the earliest version of the Canadian Ram. You can see it's got the little machine gun turret. This is supposed to be the mallet with the 2-pounder gun. The gun warped a little bit in printing. If you notice it sticks up a little bit, I might just trim that off and replace it with a different barrel at some point. But again, very cool, because if you're into, you know, the history of Sherman tanks, like I am, it's one of my favorite vehicles. This is an interesting little sort of tangent from the main Sherman development line. And it's sort of surprising, because assuming this thing's in scale, and it's pretty close, I think it's a touch big, so compared to one of my Sherman things, but you can see it's pretty darn close. That's a pretty decent sized turret, you know, especially for something that only has a 2-pounder in it. Now, they designed it originally for a 6-pounder, so to explain it, but you know, would the Ram have been a decent tank if it had gone in service? Probably. But it just was redundant once they realized that there was more than enough capacity, production capacity, of the Sherman in the United States. This is the worst print job I've done, and this is the danger of some of these really small vehicles. So this is a little tiny German, the Befelswagen, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the command version of the Panzer I with the fixed superstructure and the single machine gun. And this is the A Ausführung, so it's the even shorter hulled version. And you can see this is the problem when you get really small tanks and the tracks are part of the model. It's really hard to clear all the supporting stuff out of the suspension without tearing it up. So you can see I'm missing some chunks there, and part of this little bit broke. So this is the one I'm sort of least excited about because it is so rough looking, and then the paint job turned it out sort of shiny and crappy as well. So, you know, sort of ignore that one. And then last but not least is the T-34 heavy tank. So this thing is just monstrous. You know, I printed out and then I looked at it and I was like, good Lord, this is a big vehicle. It's actually even, you know, if I put it next to my M103 model, it's quite a bit longer than that, which makes sense because this has got 8 road wheels, you know, whereas the M103 only had 7. This one is an example. You can see the turret's a little wobbly because the whatever you want to call that, the turret stump, I don't know, cylinder is a little smaller diameter than the one here, which is just, like I said, these aren't professionally made prints. They're just things people make and put out there, and it's amazing that they're as good as they are. So really cool to be able to add a T-34. And there are, I'll get around to it at some point, but there's also versions from the same person who made that of the earlier versions of that heavy tank from World War II. So this is an example of just some of the stuff you can do if you get yourself a 3D printer. And are they as good quality as a model kit that's well put together? No, absolutely not. And you're limited by the quality of the files. And of course the files themselves, like I said, are just made by people. They can be pretty good or they can be kind of lousy. So there's just a lot of trial and error, but you know, it's fun to sort of start a print and see how it turns out. You know, you can scale it to whatever size you want. So if you wanted to make these in 1/200 scale to use as like wargaming pieces, you know, you could make a fantastic variety of wargaming pieces and vehicles and stuff. So it's really fun technology, but it does take a bit of fussing around, and it does take some time to print this stuff out. So you got to have a little bit of patience for both of those things. Anyhow, that's I guess all I've got to say. I just wanted to share my adventures in this. Again, not putting myself out there as an expert by any stretch. I'm actually, like I said, a pretty lousy model builder and probably a pretty mediocre 3D printer at this point. But, you know, for other people that just want to start out, here's an example of the kind of things you can do with it. All right, well, thank you very much. I hope you all have a great holiday weekend, and we'll catch you on the next one.